A single careless signature can change an entire lifetime, especially when destiny has already written the ending. The Grand Council Chamber of Ironcliff Palace stood silent beneath towering stone arches where centuries of Alpha Kings had shaped the future of the kingdom with little more than ink and conviction. Morning sunlight streamed through enormous stained glass windows, casting ribbons of silver and gold across the polished marble floor, while long crimson banners embroidered with the royal wolf crest hung motionless in the still air. At the far end of the chamber, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood sat alone behind an ancient oak table scarred by generations of rulers before him. At 32 years old, Ethan possessed the quiet confidence of a leader who had spent his entire adult life placing duty above personal desire. His dark hair was neatly kept, his silver-gray eyes calm yet distant, and the simple black royal coat resting across his broad shoulders reflected his preference for practicality over unnecessary luxury. To the nobles who served beneath him, he appeared unshakable. To those who knew him best, he had simply become a man who no longer expected life to surprise him. A thick leather folder rested before him, sealed with crimson wax bearing the mark of the Eastern Moon Territory. It contained the marriage agreement that had consumed months of political negotiation. 3 neighboring territories had struggled for years over disputed borders, trading accusations instead of trust, until the Royal Council proposed a solution older than any living wolf could remember. A marriage alliance. Ethan had opposed the idea at first, believing peace should never depend upon 2 strangers sharing a last name. Yet every advisor had reached the same conclusion. Without the agreement, old rivalries would continue growing. With it, the kingdom would gain decades of stability. Commander Lucas Bennett stood quietly beside the table with his hands folded behind his back. Unlike many royal officers, Lucas had served Ethan since they were both young warriors learning the responsibilities of leadership together. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "the council has reviewed every condition. Nothing remains except your signature." Ethan looked at the thick stack of parchment without reaching for it. Does anyone actually believe marriages built on contracts become happy? Lucas allowed himself the smallest smile. History suggests some do. Ethan leaned back slightly. History also suggests most rulers learn to smile for public ceremonies whether they are happy or not. A comfortable silence settled between them. Beyond the tall windows, palace gardens stretched toward distant mountains where spring had only begun touching the highest forests with shades of green. Somewhere below, servants prepared for another day filled with meetings, diplomatic visits, and ceremonial obligations. Every hour of Ethan's life had long ago been scheduled by responsibility. Personal dreams had quietly disappeared beneath the weight of the crown years before. Lucas finally spoke again. The bride's family accepted every condition without negotiation. Ethan nodded absently. "Good. Would you like to review her profile before signing?" The Alpha King shook his head almost immediately. "No." Lucas looked mildly surprised. "Your Majesty?" Ethan rested one hand upon the unopened folder. "Who she is will not change why this marriage exists." His voice carried no cruelty, only quiet resignation. Whether she is kind or distant, wealthy or humble, this agreement serves the kingdom first. Lucas studied his old friend for a long moment before slowly sliding a silver fountain pen across the polished table. Ethan picked it up without opening the folder. He never looked at the bride's portrait carefully prepared inside. He never read the description of her upbringing, her interests, or even the handwritten letter her guardians had enclosed. None of it seemed important beside the peace of thousands of families depending upon this alliance. In one smooth motion, he signed his full name across the final page. The scratching sound of ink against parchment echoed softly through the vast chamber before fading into silence. Ethan placed the pen down exactly where Lucas had left it. "It is finished," he said quietly. Lucas carefully gathered the documents, pressing the royal seal into warm wax before rolling the agreement into a protective leather case. "The wedding will take place in 7 days." Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the towering windows overlooking the kingdom he had sworn to protect. Far below, ordinary people crossed busy streets. Children laughed beside market stalls, and families began another peaceful morning without realizing that their king had just surrendered one more piece of his own future so theirs might remain secure. He felt neither excitement nor regret, only acceptance. Behind him, the sealed marriage contract rested upon the council table, carrying the name of a woman he had never seen, whose face remained completely unknown to him. Neither Ethan nor anyone else inside the palace realized that somewhere far beyond the distant mountains, destiny had quietly smiled the moment his signature touched the page. The sealed marriage contract left Ironcliff Palace before sunset, carried by two royal couriers who rode through winding mountain roads until the grand towers of the Eastern Moon Territory disappeared behind endless forests and rolling hills. Nearly 400 miles away, the Sullivan estate stood proudly upon a gentle rise overlooking fertile farmland, its white stone walls shining beneath the soft afternoon sun. From a distance, it appeared warm and welcoming, but behind its polished doors lived a family that had quietly measured affection by usefulness for many years. Inside the elegant drawing room, crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across expensive furniture, while members of the Sullivan family gathered around a polished walnut table. Richard Sullivan slowly unfolded the royal document with visible satisfaction. His wife, Margaret, leaned forward eagerly, while their eldest daughter, Victoria, admired her reflection in the silver teapot rather than paying attention to the conversation. Only one chair remained empty. "The contract has arrived," Richard announced proudly. "The Alpha King has signed it." Margaret smiled with relief. "Then everything is settled." Victoria reached for the document. "When do I leave for the palace?" Richard hesitated. A heavy silence settled over the room before he folded the parchment once again. "You are not leaving." Victoria looked up in confusion. "What do you mean?" Margaret quietly lowered her eyes. Richard inhaled slowly before speaking. "Yesterday, Lord Harrison accepted your proposal." Victoria's expression brightened immediately. Lord Harrison came from one of the wealthiest noble families in the territory. She had spent nearly a year hoping to marry him instead of an unfamiliar king she had never met. "Then who?" Her question ended before it was spoken. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the staircase. Upstairs, Grace Sullivan carefully arranged freshly washed bed linens inside a small guest room that no visitors had used in months. At 23 years old, Grace looked remarkably similar to her older sister at first glance, with fair skin, soft features, and long chestnut hair that fell in gentle waves across her shoulders. Yet where Victoria carried herself with practiced elegance, Grace moved with quiet humility. Her simple blue dress showed careful repairs along one sleeve, and although she belonged to the same family, she had long ago grown accustomed to receiving only what remained after everyone else had chosen first. She heard her father calling her name and hurried downstairs without delay. "Yes, father?" she asked politely as she entered the room. Richard looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "The royal marriage will proceed." Grace nodded. "That is wonderful news for Victoria." Another silence followed. Margaret finally stood and crossed the room, gently taking Grace's hands into her own. The unexpected gesture alone made Grace uneasy. It had been years since her mother had shown such tenderness. "There has been a change of plans," Margaret said softly. Grace searched her mother's face without understanding. Richard placed the sealed marriage contract upon the table. "You will be the bride." The words seemed to stop time itself. Grace blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood. "Me?" Richard nodded. "The Alpha King does not know which daughter signed the family agreement. The contract requires only a daughter of the Sullivan bloodline." Grace looked toward Victoria, who avoided her eyes completely. Understanding arrived slowly, carrying neither anger nor surprise. She had spent most of her life stepping quietly into places others no longer wanted. This was simply the largest place she had ever been asked to fill. "Because Victoria wishes to marry Lord Harrison," Grace whispered. No one answered. They did not need to. Grace lowered her gaze toward the polished wooden floor. Countless thoughts rushed through her mind. She knew almost nothing about the Alpha King except the stories travelers occasionally shared in village markets. They described a wise ruler, a disciplined warrior, a man respected throughout every territory. Some claimed he rarely smiled. Others insisted duty mattered more to him than personal happiness. None of those stories included the possibility that he might someday become her husband. Margaret gently squeezed Grace's hands. "We know this is unexpected." Grace slowly lifted her eyes again. "Did he choose me?" Richard answered honestly. "No. She nodded once. Somehow that truth hurt less than she expected. The Alpha King had not rejected her because he had never known she existed. Grace walked quietly toward the window, overlooking the gardens where she had spent countless afternoons tending flowers nobody else noticed. She watched spring breezes move through rows of white blossoms while birds crossed the bright blue sky above the estate. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, calm despite the uncertainty growing inside her heart. "When do I leave?" she finally asked. Richard looked relieved by the absence of argument. "Tomorrow morning." Grace accepted the answer with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every disappointment life had already given her. She did not ask why she had been chosen only after someone else refused. She did not ask whether the Alpha King would welcome a bride who had never been anyone's first choice. Instead, she simply nodded, folded her hands before her, and silently promised herself one thing. No matter what awaited beyond those distant mountains, she would enter her new life with kindness instead of resentment, because losing hope had never once made the world gentler. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed in soft shades of blue and gold as the first rays of sunlight reached the rolling hills surrounding the Sullivan estate. Dew glistened across endless fields while birds welcomed the new day with cheerful songs that seemed strangely at odds with the quiet farewell unfolding near the front gate. A polished black carriage bearing the royal crest waited patiently beside four magnificent horses, their silver harnesses sparkling beneath the early morning light. Two members of the royal guard stood respectfully nearby, offering neither urgency nor impatience. They understood the importance of this journey. Inside the grand house, servants hurried through the halls carrying trunks and carefully folded garments, yet no joyful excitement filled the rooms. Grace Sullivan quietly closed the small wooden chest that held everything she planned to bring with her. Unlike the elaborate luggage prepared for noble daughters, hers contained only a few modest dresses, several books her grandmother had once given her, a sewing kit, and a tiny pressed wildflower carefully preserved between the pages of an old journal. She gently ran her fingertips across the faded flower before placing the journal inside the chest. It was the only keepsake she truly treasured. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret entered slowly, carrying a neatly wrapped bundle of fresh bread. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. Margaret carefully placed the bundle beside the luggage. "You may become hungry during the trip," she said quietly. Grace smiled with sincere gratitude. "Thank you." Her mother looked at her for several long seconds before speaking again. "I know this was not the future you expected." Grace lowered her eyes gently. "Neither was it yours." Margaret's expression softened. "No." She hesitated before reaching forward to adjust a loose strand of Grace's chestnut hair behind her ear, a simple gesture she had not performed since Grace was a little girl. "You have always made difficult things seem easier than they truly were." Grace covered her mother's hand with her own for just a moment. "Perhaps because I learned early that resisting every disappointment only makes the heart more tired." Margaret blinked quickly before looking away. There were many things she wanted to say, many apologies she had never found the courage to offer, but years of quiet distance could not be repaired in a single morning. Instead, she simply embraced her daughter with unexpected tenderness. Grace returned the embrace without hesitation, holding no bitterness for the years already gone. Outside, Richard Sullivan waited beside the carriage speaking with the captain of the royal escort, while Victoria remained on the front steps, wearing an elegant traveling dress prepared for a different future. As Grace emerged carrying her small chest, every conversation quietly stopped. Richard cleared his throat. "The palace is nearly 3 days away if the weather remains favorable." Grace nodded politely. "I understand." Victoria finally stepped forward, her expression difficult to read. "Grace." Her younger sister looked toward her with gentle curiosity. Victoria lowered her voice. "I never asked for this to happen." Grace offered a calm smile. "I know. Are you angry?" Grace considered the question honestly before answering. "No." Victoria looked surprised. "Why not?" Grace glanced toward the waiting carriage where the royal crest reflected the morning sunlight. "Because anger cannot choose a different road once the journey has already begun." The answer lingered between them. For the first time in many years, Victoria seemed unable to find the right words. Grace embraced her sister briefly before stepping toward the carriage. One of the royal guards carefully lifted her modest luggage into the rear compartment, while another respectfully opened the carriage door. As Grace settled into the comfortable seat, she looked back through the window one final time. The estate where she had spent her entire life slowly grew smaller as the horses began moving along the winding road leading toward distant mountains. She felt no excitement, yet neither did she feel fear. Only quiet uncertainty. Hundreds of miles away, inside Ironcliff Palace, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood walked alone through the Eastern Gardens before the day's council meetings began. Spring blossoms lined every stone pathway, while fountains reflected the clear morning sky. Commander Lucas Bennett soon joined him carrying several scrolls tucked beneath one arm. Preparations for the wedding continue smoothly, Lucas reported. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly while watching gardeners carefully trim white rose bushes surrounding the central courtyard. Good. Lucas studied him for a moment. You still have not asked anything about her. Ethan smiled faintly. Would knowing her favorite flower change the treaty? Lucas laughed softly. Probably not. Ethan continued walking at an unhurried pace. Then I would rather meet my future wife without expectations created by other people. Lucas folded his arms thoughtfully. Most men would at least ask what she looks like. Ethan paused beside a quiet, reflecting pool where sunlight shimmered across perfectly still water. Appearances fade, he replied. Character does not. The commander smiled with quiet respect. Then I hope the moon goddess has chosen wisely. Ethan looked across the peaceful gardens stretching toward the palace walls, unaware that at that very moment a young woman carrying nothing but quiet courage was traveling steadily toward the same gates. Neither of them could possibly know that every mile drawing them closer together also brought them one step nearer to a meeting that would forever change not only their own lives, but the future of the entire kingdom. By the afternoon of the third day, the towering walls of Ironcliff Palace finally appeared beyond the last ridge, rising above the valley like a city carved from sunlight and stone. Massive white towers reached toward the clear spring sky, while silver banners bearing the royal wolf crest flowed gracefully from every balcony. The broad road leading to the palace had been lined with fresh flowers, polished lanterns, and rows of guards dressed in ceremonial armor that reflected the warm afternoon light. Grace Sullivan quietly watched through the carriage window as the magnificent view unfolded before her. It was more beautiful than any place she had ever imagined, yet the grandeur only reminded her how small her own life had always seemed. The carriage passed beneath an enormous stone arch where musicians welcomed arriving nobles with gentle melodies played on violins and horns. Noble families stepped from elegant carriages wearing expensive fabrics embroidered with silver thread, their conversations filled with excitement and curiosity about the royal wedding. Grace instinctively smoothed the simple ivory wedding gown resting across her lap. Although the palace tailors had adjusted it after her arrival, its design remained modest compared to the elaborate gowns surrounding her. She did not mind. Simplicity had always felt more honest than decoration. Palace attendants greeted her with respectful bows before escorting her through endless marble hallways illuminated by crystal chandeliers and tall windows overlooking blooming royal gardens. Every servant smiled politely. No one looked at her with pity or quiet disappointment the way people had back home. That unexpected kindness eased the nervousness resting inside her heart. An elderly palace maid named Eleanor gently guided Grace toward a beautifully prepared bridal chamber where fresh white roses filled the air with a delicate fragrance. You have a little time before the ceremony, Eleanor said warmly while helping arrange the final folds of the wedding dress. Grace looked around the elegant room, noticing the embroidered curtains, polished oak furniture, and sunlight pouring gently across the floor. Everything is beautiful, she whispered. Eleanor smiled. His Majesty insists that every guest deserves to feel welcome. Grace lowered her eyes thoughtfully. The story she had heard described a distant king devoted only to responsibility. Yet every detail surrounding her suggested someone who quietly cared about the comfort of others even when he never expected praise. Several corridors away, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood inside the royal ceremonial chamber while attendants adjusted the dark formal jacket embroidered with subtle silver patterns reserved only for state occasions. Commander Lucas Bennett fastened the final clasp before stepping back, with quiet satisfaction. "Everything is ready," Lucas said. Ethan nodded while looking at his reflection in the tall mirror. The royal attire fit perfectly, yet somehow it felt heavier than armor. "How many guests arrived?" he asked. "Nearly every noble family in the kingdom." Lucas smiled faintly. "Everyone wishes to witness history." Ethan gave a quiet laugh. "History usually becomes more interesting after it has already happened." Lucas reached into a small wooden box resting nearby and carefully removed 2 simple wedding rings crafted from polished white gold. "You still have time if you wish to review your bride's portrait." Ethan shook his head with the same calm certainty he had shown days earlier. "No." Lucas sighed with amused disbelief. "You truly intend to meet your future wife for the very first time at the altar." Ethan accepted the wedding ring and slipped it into his pocket. If this marriage begins with honesty, then first impressions should also be honest. Outside, palace bells began ringing softly across the enormous courtyard, signaling that the ceremony would soon begin. Hundreds of guests gradually filled the magnificent royal hall, where towering marble columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with ancient scenes honoring the moon goddess. Thousands of candles flickered gently despite the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that filled the room with shimmering colors of blue, gold, and silver. Ethan entered first, walking calmly toward the front of the hall beneath the respectful gaze of nobles, elders, diplomats, and royal officers. His expression remained composed, revealing neither excitement nor anxiety. To him, this ceremony represented another responsibility accepted for the sake of his kingdom. Soft music suddenly drifted through the hall as the enormous carved doors at the far end slowly began to open. Every conversation faded into silence. Ethan lifted his eyes almost absent-mindedly toward the entrance, expecting nothing more than the formal beginning of a carefully arranged ceremony. Grace stepped through the doorway beside Eleanor, her modest ivory gown flowing gently with each graceful step as sunlight surrounded her like a quiet morning glow. Her chestnut hair rested softly across her shoulders beneath a delicate veil, and although nervousness shimmered within her gentle eyes, kindness remained stronger than fear upon her peaceful face. She neither searched for admiration nor attempted to impress anyone around her. She simply walked forward with quiet dignity, carrying herself exactly as she had throughout every difficult season of her life. The distance between them slowly disappeared one careful step at a time. Ethan watched her approach, and for reasons he could not explain, the enormous hall seemed to fall strangely silent around him. The music grew distant. The murmuring guests disappeared beneath an unfamiliar stillness. Something deep within him stirred with quiet intensity, awakening for the very first time as Grace finally lifted her eyes and their gazes met across the royal hall. The instant Grace's eyes met Ethan's, something invisible rippled through the magnificent hall with a force no one else could see. Ethan had stood before kings, generals, and thousands of warriors without the slightest tremor, yet now every carefully disciplined instinct inside him fell unexpectedly silent. His heartbeat slowed instead of racing. The distant music seemed to disappear beneath an overwhelming sense of recognition that reached far beyond memory. Deep within him, the ancient wolf that had remained calm through countless ceremonies stirred awake for the first time in his life. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was reverence. Ethan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the wedding ring hidden within his palm as an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He had never believed the old stories told by elders about wolves recognizing their destined companions at first sight. Those legends belonged to another age, spoken beside winter fires to children who still believed destiny always arrived wrapped in miracles. Yet nothing inside him could deny what was happening. His wolf, proud and unyielding by nature, no longer urged him to lead. Instead, it bowed in complete and unquestioning devotion before the quiet woman walking toward him. Grace noticed the subtle change in his expression long before she reached the altar. Every story she had heard described the Alpha King as composed beyond emotion, but now his silver-gray eyes reflected something she could not name. There was no arrogance, no coldness, only quiet astonishment mixed with profound peace. It made her own nervousness soften just enough for her breathing to steady. She lowered her eyes respectfully for a moment before taking the final step beside him. The royal officiant smiled warmly as he welcomed them both beneath the towering marble arch carved with ancient moon symbols. Hundreds of guests watched in respectful silence while sunlight poured through stained glass windows, surrounding the couple with shimmering shades of silver and gold. Commander Lucas Bennett stood only a few feet away, prepared to assist with the ceremony if necessary. At first, he believed Ethan had simply become distracted by the significance of the moment. Then he noticed something impossible to ignore. The Alpha King's normally perfect posture had subtly changed. His shoulders, always held with quiet command, had relaxed as though some invisible burden had suddenly disappeared. More remarkable still was the expression in his eyes. Lucas had known Ethan for nearly 20 years and had never once seen him look at another person with such complete attention. It was as though the entire hall had vanished, leaving only the young woman standing beside him. Across the front rows, several elderly members of the Moon Council quietly exchanged uncertain glances. High Elder Miriam Ashcroft narrowed her eyes thoughtfully before taking one slow step closer. She had witnessed many royal ceremonies throughout her long life, but something ancient stirred within her memory as she observed the silence surrounding the Alpha King. Grace folded her hands gently before her, trying to calm the quiet uncertainty inside her heart. She wondered if Ethan regretted agreeing to this marriage now that he had finally seen the woman chosen in another's place. She had prepared herself for politeness, perhaps even respectful distance, but she had not expected this profound stillness. Ethan slowly turned toward her, and for the first time since becoming king, words failed him completely. He had rehearsed a dozen formal greetings during the previous week, yet none remained. Looking into Grace's gentle eyes, every carefully prepared sentence seemed unnecessary. She offered him a small, sincere smile, not because he wore a crown, but because she sensed he needed reassurance just as much as she did. That single smile reached him more deeply than any royal speech ever could. The ancient bond inside him responded immediately with quiet certainty. Lucas noticed Ethan drawing one slow breath before finally speaking. "Welcome to Ironcliff Palace," he said softly. Grace's smile grew just a little warmer. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Ethan gently shook his head. "Today, you may call me Ethan." Several nearby nobles looked mildly surprised by the informality, but Grace simply nodded. "Then thank you, Ethan." Hearing his own name spoken so naturally by her somehow made the moment feel even more real. High Elder Miriam quietly approached the officiant and whispered something too softly for the guests to hear. The officiant's eyes widened ever so slightly before glancing toward the couple once more. Meanwhile, Ethan's wolf remained perfectly still within him, not demanding possession, not roaring with dominance, but kneeling in complete peace before the woman beside him. The sensation filled Ethan with quiet humility rather than pride. He suddenly understood that true strength did not always stand above others. Sometimes it willingly lowered itself before something infinitely more precious. As Grace looked toward the gathered guests, unaware of the ancient awakening unfolding inside the Alpha King, sunlight illuminated the delicate veil resting across her chestnut hair, and every instinct Ethan possessed whispered the same undeniable truth. The marriage contract may have been signed by duty, but the moment their eyes met, destiny quietly erased every reason that had brought them there except one. For several long seconds, no one in the magnificent hall moved. The silence carried an unusual weight, not born from uncertainty, but from the quiet feeling that something ancient had awakened beneath the marble floors of Ironcliff Palace. High Elder Miriam Ashcroft slowly stepped away from the front row, her silver robes gliding softly across the polished stone as every noble instinctively made room for her. At nearly 80 years old, she had witnessed 6 royal coronations, countless alliance ceremonies, and more political marriages than anyone else still living. Yet the expression upon her face reflected neither surprise nor confusion. Instead, it carried the quiet recognition of someone who had waited an entire lifetime to see a forgotten prophecy become reality. Ethan noticed her approaching and respectfully inclined his head. "High Elder." Miriam looked first at Ethan, then at Grace, before allowing a gentle smile to appear. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "may I ask you a single question before the ceremony continues?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Her calm eyes never left his. When you looked upon your bride, what did your wolf do? The question seemed strangely personal, yet something inside Ethan urged him to answer honestly. He took one slow breath before speaking. It became completely still. Miriam continued watching him without interruption. Ethan searched for words that could explain a feeling unlike anything he had ever experienced. Then, he continued quietly, it bowed. The final word echoed gently through the vast hall. Several elders immediately exchanged astonished glances while whispers spread through the front rows of honored guests. Commander Lucas Bennett looked toward Miriam in silent confusion. What does that mean? He asked. Miriam slowly turned toward the gathered assembly. According to the oldest records of our ancestors, she began, there exists a bond so rare that many believed it had disappeared centuries ago. Every voice in the hall faded into respectful silence. Most destined mates recognize one another through instinct, trust, or time. But there is another bond spoken of only within the oldest temple scrolls. When an alpha's wolf willingly kneels instead of claiming dominance, it recognizes not merely a mate, but the woman chosen by the moon goddess to stand beside him as an equal. Grace blinked softly, clearly overwhelmed. Surely there must be some mistake, she whispered. Miriam smiled kindly. Child, ancient blessings rarely announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves through quiet certainty. Ethan looked toward Grace again, and the same peaceful certainty settled inside him. There was nothing forced about it. No overwhelming command. No loss of reason. Instead, every instinct simply assured him that standing beside her felt more natural than standing alone had ever been. Miriam carefully reached into the sleeve of her robe and withdrew a small parchment wrapped in faded blue ribbon. The delicate paper had clearly survived generations of careful preservation. Many years ago, she explained, our predecessors recorded a prophecy concerning the royal bloodline. She gently unfolded the fragile document while the hall listened in complete stillness. It speaks of a king who would sign an alliance for duty alone, only to discover that destiny had quietly hidden his greatest blessing inside an ordinary promise. Grace lowered her eyes, unable to believe such words could possibly concern her. Miriam continued reading. The future Luna shall not arrive through ambition, wealth, or noble pride. She shall carry humility where others seek honor, kindness where others seek advantage, and quiet strength where others expect power. The elderly woman's voice softened even further. When the king's wolf kneels freely before her, the kingdom shall know that leadership has found its rightful heart. The parchment slowly lowered back into her hands. Not a single guest spoke. Even those who had attended merely for political reasons now looked toward Grace with completely different eyes. She remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, her hands gently folded before her, her expression filled more with humility than excitement. Ethan realized that nothing about her had changed. Only everyone else's understanding had. The royal officiant looked respectfully toward Miriam before turning back to the couple. High Elder, he asked carefully. Do you believe the moon goddess has already given her blessing? Miriam answered without hesitation. I believe she did long before either of them knew the other's name. Ethan slowly reached for Grace's hand, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished. Instead, she quietly placed her hand in his, her gentle smile carrying the same quiet courage that had guided her through every disappointment life had placed before her. Their fingers met naturally, without hesitation or uncertainty. A warm breeze drifted through the open windows at that exact moment, gently stirring the white banners hanging throughout the hall while sunlight poured across the marble floor with renewed brilliance. Guests instinctively turned toward the bright windows, and several elders smiled knowingly at the perfect timing, though none claimed it as proof of anything beyond hope. Ethan looked into Grace's eyes once more and realized something remarkable. Only a week earlier he had believed this marriage would begin with sacrifice. Standing beside her now, he no longer felt that he had given anything away. Instead, for the very first time since wearing the crown, he quietly wondered whether destiny had been protecting a gift until the exact moment he was finally ready to receive it. The wedding ceremony continued beneath a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had come before. Moments earlier, the gathered nobles had watched what they believed was a political alliance. Now they stood as quiet witnesses to something far older than any treaty ever written upon parchment. The royal officiant lifted the polished white gold rings with steady hands while sunlight continued pouring through the stained glass windows, filling the great hall with shimmering colors that danced across the marble floor. Ethan never released Grace's hand. Instead, he looked at her with calm certainty, no longer seeing an unfamiliar bride chosen through negotiation, but a woman whose quiet presence had somehow reached the deepest part of his soul before either of them had spoken more than a handful of words. The officiant smiled warmly before beginning the ancient vows. "Your Majesty, do you freely accept Grace Sullivan as your lawful wife, your equal before the moon goddess, and your partner in protecting this kingdom?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I do." His voice remained steady, yet everyone present sensed a warmth they had never heard from their king before. The officiant turned toward Grace. "Grace Sullivan, do you freely accept Ethan Blackwood as your lawful husband, your equal before the moon goddess, and your partner for all seasons yet to come?" Grace looked into Ethan's silver-gray eyes for only a moment before quietly smiling. "I do." There was no dramatic declaration, no elaborate speech, only two simple words spoken with complete sincerity. Somehow they carried more meaning than every carefully rehearsed promise offered during countless royal ceremonies throughout history. The rings were exchanged beneath the towering marble arch, while musicians gently resumed their melody. As Ethan carefully placed the ring upon Grace's finger, he noticed how naturally her hand rested within his, as though destiny had patiently shaped that moment long before either of them had been born. Grace then slipped the matching ring onto Ethan's hand with equal care. The polished gold reflected the afternoon sunlight before settling quietly into place. The officiant raised his hands with a peaceful smile. "Before the moon goddess, before your people, and before the laws of this kingdom, I now present Alpha King Ethan Blackwood and Luna Grace Blackwood." The magnificent hall immediately filled with warm applause. Nobles, elders, commanders, diplomats, and palace staff all rose to their feet in celebration. Yet among the joyful expressions, several visitors exchanged noticeably uneasy glances. Near the center of the assembly stood Richard Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan, and Victoria Sullivan, who had arrived shortly before the ceremony at the invitation of the royal council. Richard's face reflected open astonishment. He had expected his younger daughter to quietly fulfill a political obligation before fading into palace life with little attention. Instead, every respected elder in the kingdom now regarded Grace with reverence usually reserved only for history itself. Victoria remained motionless as she watched Ethan gently guide Grace down the first steps from the ceremonial platform. For the first time in her life, she looked at her younger sister without seeing someone standing in her shadow. Nearby nobles gradually approached to offer congratulations. Duke William Hawthorne bowed respectfully before Grace. "Your Majesty," he said kindly, "our kingdom is honored to welcome you." Grace smiled with humble gratitude. "Thank you. I hope to serve with kindness." Lady Eleanor Whitmore added warmly, "We have heard many stories about royal strength. Today we witnessed royal grace as well." Grace lowered her eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable with so much praise. Ethan noticed her quiet humility and found himself smiling without realizing it. Commander Lucas Bennet quietly stepped closer. "Your Majesty," he said to Ethan, "the council requests that you greet the noble families before the evening banquet." Ethan nodded before looking toward Grace. "Would you mind walking with me?" Grace answered with gentle confidence. "I would be honored." Together they crossed the grand hall, greeting every guest with patience and genuine attention. Ethan noticed something remarkable almost immediately. Grace remembered names after hearing them only once. She thanked every palace servant who opened a door or adjusted a chair. She listened carefully whenever elderly guests spoke, never pretending interest simply because protocol demanded it. None of those actions had been taught by royal tutors. They belonged entirely to her character. Across the hall, High Elder Miriam quietly observed every interaction before turning toward Commander Lucas. "Do you see it now?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded. "I thought the prophecy spoke only about the king." Miriam smiled knowingly. "No, it speaks equally about the woman who quietly changes the king." Ethan glanced toward Grace once more as she paused to comfort a nervous young flower attendant who who had accidentally dropped several white roses onto the polished floor. Instead of allowing servants to rush forward, Grace simply knelt beside the child, helped gather every flower with an encouraging smile, and gently placed the bouquet back into the girl's trembling hands. The child immediately smiled through relieved eyes. Ethan watched the small moment unfold from several steps away. No one had asked Grace to do it. No audience had expected it. It was simply who she was. At that quiet instant, Ethan understood something far greater than prophecy. A kingdom would never become stronger merely because it had chosen the right queen. It would become stronger because the right queen chose kindness even when no one believed anyone important was watching. The celebrations continued long after sunset as thousands of lanterns illuminated the palace gardens with warm golden light, transforming every pathway into a river of shimmering reflections beneath the clear spring sky. Music drifted gently through the evening air while guests wandered among blooming roses, elegant fountains, and marble terraces overlooking the valley below. Laughter filled the gardens, yet for the first time all day, Ethan and Grace found themselves briefly alone. They had quietly slipped away from the grand banquet onto a peaceful balcony overlooking the royal orchards where soft evening breezes carried the fragrance of fresh blossoms through the cool night air. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them felt surprisingly comfortable, not awkward. Ethan rested his hands lightly upon the carved stone railing while looking toward the distant lights of villages scattered across the countryside. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. Grace turned toward him with gentle curiosity. "For what?" He smiled faintly without looking away from the horizon. "When I signed the marriage contract, I never opened your file. I never looked at your portrait. I believed I was making a sacrifice for the kingdom." Grace remained quiet for a moment before answering. "You were protecting your people." Ethan slowly nodded. "That is what I told myself." He looked toward her at last. "Now I realize I entered this marriage believing duty would be enough." Grace's expression remained calm and understanding. "Many people marry for duty." "Yes," Ethan replied softly. "But very few discover that duty was quietly leading them towards something far better." Grace lowered her eyes, touched by his honesty. She folded her hands together before speaking. "May I tell you something?" "Always." She took one slow breath. "When my father told me I would become your bride, I knew I was not the daughter originally meant for this marriage." Ethan listened without interrupting. "I understood that I had simply taken someone else's place." She smiled gently, though sadness briefly passed through her eyes. "I promised myself only one thing. If I could not become the wife you expected, then perhaps I could at least become someone who treated you with kindness." Ethan felt an unexpected ache in his heart. "Grace." She looked at him again. "I never expected anything more." Ethan stepped a little closer, his expression filled with quiet sincerity. "Then allow me to tell you what I never expected." He smiled warmly. "I never expected to meet someone who thanks every servant by name, who comforts frightened children before introducing herself to nobles, or who carries kindness so naturally that it becomes part of every conversation." Grace laughed softly, the sound blending beautifully with the distant music floating across the gardens. "Those are ordinary things." Ethan gently shook his head. "No." His silver-gray eyes reflected the lantern light. "They should be ordinary. Unfortunately, they are rare." Grace looked toward the stars beginning to appear above the palace towers. "My grandmother used to tell me that people remember how they were treated much longer than they remember impressive speeches." Ethan smiled. She was very wise. They continued walking slowly through the moonlit garden paths lined with white roses and flowering trees. Palace gardeners quietly bowed as they passed, but neither Ethan nor Grace allowed formal ceremony to interrupt the peaceful conversation unfolding between them. For the first time in many years, Ethan realized he was speaking not as a king delivering careful words, but simply as a man discovering genuine companionship. "What did you dream about before all this?" he asked. Grace looked thoughtfully toward a nearby fountain where moonlight shimmered across still water. "I wanted a small cottage filled with books, flowers, and enough room for people who needed somewhere peaceful to rest." Ethan smiled. "That is a very specific dream." She laughed again, perhaps because it was simple. "And now?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Now I hope this palace can become that place for others." Ethan stopped walking. "Then we share the same dream." Grace looked at him with surprise. Ethan continued, "A palace should never feel distant from the people it serves." He gestured toward the warmly lit windows overlooking the gardens. "If we can make this place kinder, then perhaps the kingdom itself will become kinder too." Grace's eyes brightened with quiet hope. "I would like that very much." Across the garden, High Elder Miriam watched the young couple from a respectful distance before quietly smiling to herself. Commander Lucas joined her carrying 2 cups of warm tea. "You seem pleased," he observed. Miriam accepted 1 cup with grateful hands. "Look carefully." Lucas turned toward Ethan and Grace. They were no longer discussing treaties or ceremonies. Instead, they stood beside a flowering tree, smiling as they admired a family of songbirds settling into their nest for the night. "They hardly know each other," Lucas said. Miriam nodded gently. "Exactly." She looked toward the stars above Ironcliff Palace. "The oldest bonds do not begin with grand declarations. They begin with 2 hearts choosing to remain open long enough to truly see one another." Beneath the peaceful spring sky, Ethan and Grace continued their quiet walk through the gardens, discovering that while destiny may have brought them together in a single unforgettable moment, love itself would be built slowly through shared kindness, honest conversations, gentle laughter, and the countless ordinary moments that quietly become the most extraordinary memories of all. Several months passed, and with the arrival of early summer the kingdom seemed brighter than anyone could remember. The palace gardens overflowed with roses, lavender, and climbing ivy while fountains sparkled beneath endless blue skies. Travelers arriving from distant territories quickly noticed that something inside Ironcliff Palace had quietly changed. The grand halls still reflected the dignity expected of a royal court, but the atmosphere had grown warmer. Servants smiled more freely. Noble guests lingered longer in conversation. Children visiting with their families no longer felt intimidated by towering marble corridors because they knew the young Luna would eventually kneel to greet them with genuine kindness. Grace Blackwood had never attempted to become admired. She simply continued living according to the same quiet principles that had guided her long before she entered the palace. Every morning, she walked through the royal kitchens thanking the cooks before breakfast began. She visited the palace gardens to speak with elderly gardeners who had served the royal family for decades, remembering each by name and asking about their families with sincere interest. She established a small reading room beside the eastern courtyard where children of palace workers could borrow books and spend peaceful afternoons learning beneath wide oak trees. None of these changes required royal decrees. They required only compassion practiced consistently. Ethan watched those small moments more often than anyone realized. During council meetings, he found himself asking not only whether a proposal strengthened the kingdom, but whether it reflected the kindness Grace naturally brought into every room she entered. More than once Commander Lucas Bennett noticed the difference. One afternoon after a lengthy discussion concerning trade routes, Lucas smiled quietly as Ethan requested additional support for several farming villages recovering from difficult harvests. "That sounds like something Her Majesty would suggest," Lucas observed. Ethan laughed softly. "Perhaps wisdom is easier to recognize once someone teaches you how it feels." Across the kingdom, stories about the new Luna spread faster than official announcements ever could. Merchants spoke about the queen, who personally welcomed travelers arriving after long journeys. Village elders told children about the young woman who remembered every servant's birthday. Palace guards quietly smiled whenever visitors asked whether the stories were exaggerated. They always answered the same way. If anything, the stories are too small. One bright afternoon, Richard Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan, and Victoria arrived at the palace for the annual summer gathering of noble families. Months earlier, they had entered these halls expecting Grace to disappear quietly into political duty. Instead, they found themselves greeted by citizens who respectfully bowed whenever the Luna passed through the gardens. Grace welcomed her family exactly as she welcomed everyone else, with warmth untouched by old disappointments. She embraced her mother first, smiled kindly at her father, and greeted Victoria with genuine affection. Richard looked around the lively courtyard where children laughed beside flower beds, while Ethan spoke comfortably with local craftsmen rather than separating himself behind ceremony. "You have changed this place," he admitted quietly. Grace gently shook her head. "No, We changed it together. Ethan approached just then and greeted the Sullivan family with sincere respect. There was no trace of obligation in his voice. Richard studied the Alpha King for several moments before speaking honestly. Your Majesty, I believed I was sending you the daughter nobody had chosen first. Ethan looked toward Grace with unmistakable warmth before answering. You sent me the greatest gift either of us could have received. Richard lowered his head, humbled by words he knew he had not earned. As evening approached, Ethan and Grace walked once more through the same palace gardens where they had shared their first quiet conversation after the wedding. Summer breezes carried the fragrance of blooming roses while the setting sun painted the palace towers with gentle shades of gold. Ethan reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully removed a folded piece of parchment that had been preserved inside a protective leather case. Grace immediately recognized the royal seal. The marriage contract, she said softly. Ethan nodded. He unfolded the document slowly, looking at the signature he had written months earlier without reading the name of the woman whose future had become forever joined with his own. A quiet smile appeared on his face. I once believed this was the most important signature of my life, he said. Grace looked at him curiously. Do you still believe that? Ethan folded the parchment again before placing it gently back into its case. No. He reached for her hand with the same quiet certainty he had discovered on their wedding day. The signature only began the journey. Every choice we have made together since then has mattered far more. Grace smiled as the last rays of sunlight illuminated the white gold ring resting upon her hand. Around them the palace gardens glowed with peaceful evening light, while laughter drifted softly across the terraces from families gathering for supper. Ethan realized that the contract had created a marriage, but kindness had created a home. Far below the palace, ordinary people ended another safe and hopeful day without knowing that the greatest decision their king had ever made was not written in ink at all. It had been made the moment he chose to truly see the quiet woman standing before him. And from that single choice grew a kingdom where duty found compassion, power found humility, and destiny found two hearts ready to walk the same path together for every season yet to come.